introduce you, my friend and colleague, Dr. Jonassen.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, Barbara said STEM problem solving, which is a fairly inclusive concept. So this is what I came up with on the way down. For the last decade, I've argued that problems vary. And this is where my work has really taken off on a pretty much an orthogonal vector from, I've been working in physics a lot. Whereas most traditional problem-solving stuff dealt with all kinds of problems in the same way. And I started analyzing the field and I said, well, I don't know, I think problems are really different. And they differ in terms of well-structured, ill-structured. And the irony, of course, is that the only time you ever see a well-structured problem is in the classroom. And once you leave the classroom, virtually every problem you encounter in your everyday life and in your work and so on is an ill-structured problem. I work a lot with engineering, and basically engineering problems are all very ill-structured. We published a study in Journal of Engineering Ed a couple of years ago where we interviewed a whole bunch of engineers and asked about a problem they had. All of their problems were emergent, they were ill-structured, there was no correct answer, there was no known solution path, they couldn't agree on what the solution criteria were, except on time and under budget, and so on and so forth. So, one of my crusades has been trying to get more ill-structured problem solving into the curriculum, although I haven't been terribly successful at that. There are some people who do that. There's a guy in Minnesota who does work in physics with what he calls context-rich problems, which the students find very challenging because they develop these scripts for solving well-structured problems. So problems also vary in complexity, okay? And there's a relationship between complexity and ill-structuredness, but it's not a direct one. Some well-structured problems like games, like chess, which was actually a lot of the early problem-solving research was done in, well-structured in terms of the number of moves and kinds of moves you can make, phenomenally complex because there's 10 to the 12th power of possible combinations of positions there and moves you can make, and so it's very complex. Some concepts are more abstract, some are more embedded, some are problems also aggregate. One of the examples I use an awful lot, if you want to start up a boutique downtown, for instance, if you were so inclined, here or anywhere else for that matter, you got a ton of problems. You got inventory problems, you got to figure out what you want to sell, you got to market it, you got to set a financial system. It's a whole huge host of problems that have to be solved. But we don't teach kids how to do that in schools. But at any rate, based upon this, I came up with a typology, a taxonomy, a typology. I've insisted on that, although I'm backing off that now, of different kinds of problems. Algorithmic problems and story problems, and textbook problems. A lot of people claim they aren't problems, and I agree with that, but a lot of other people believe they are problems. So, a physics problem in a textbook is, in one sense, it's not a problem because we know what the answer is. And we know how to get the answer. Okay? The stuff we're trying to work with is actually getting the students to understand what it is they're doing, or try to understand the problem while they're solving, because we just finished a bunch of interviews with physics students, and they all admit that, I look for the number of variables, I find an equation to fit it, and I plug the values in, and they miss the physics. They don't understand the underlying, their underlying epistemological commitments are very immature. They don't understand what they're doing, and so on. So, decision-making problems are everywhere. We all make decisions all the time. Troubleshooting, diagnosis, solution problems. Actually, as of the fall, I think I'm going to be over to College of Medicine, have time designing a new problem-based learning program in what's called clinical translational sciences. MU actually has one of, if not the most successful problem-based learning program in the world in the medical school. Our students went from, on average, 2 points below the national average on both sections of the National Medical Licensure Boards. And in 2 years, and every year since, with one exception, 2002 was an aberration that no one can explain, they scored over a standard deviation above the mean. So it's a 1.1, 1.2 sigma effect, which is pretty significant. But more importantly, these kids actually get sought out for residencies. A lot of med school graduates have problems finding residencies. People know if you come to the University of Missouri program, you actually know how to diagnose, and so they get the pick of the litter, which is which is a significant, albeit not an anecdotal piece of evidence. Strategic performance problems, those are more difficult. Being a day trader, actually one of the best examples is being an NFL quarterback. You're constantly solving problems in real time, not leisure time. You gotta fire a bunch of, you gotta select a tactic and apply that tactic in order to meet a strategy in real time while maintaining situational awareness. Military is interested in this kind of stuff, particularly for pilot training. Okay. The Air Force has a real problem with their pilots because their weapon systems are so sophisticated and complex now that they're actually playing with their weapons and smack into a mountain. Whoops.
That's a problem.
That's a problem. It's a real problem. Policy analysis problems you get in business, like planning problems is a new one I've added in there. Design problems, what we do, I'm working on, I got a paper coming out on design problem solving. And finally, dilemmas, and that's what we're dealing with over in engineering ed. We're dealing with ethics problems, engineering ethics, which tend to be either decisions or dilemmas, depending upon how you interpret them. So my goal has been to try to develop an instructional design model, and that will be my next book. If I actually can ever get enough, I need another 2 or 3 models for actually pulling that together. The idea was to try to develop an instructional design model for every kind of problem solving. I've done that for story problems. You all have vivid recollections of these kinds of problems. Actually, I should have used the other one. Actually, it was a great Gary Larson cartoon. It's called Hell's Library, and it's an entire set of bookshelves with story problems on them. Whoops. I came up with a model here. I'm flipping that around a little bit, but basically we want to basically focus and get the kids to think about what the nature of the problem is. What kind of problem? What are the issues here? What's going on? How are the forces or whatever affecting each other? Most kids come into physics with naive ontologies that basically ascribe all of the forces and physics characteristics to the matter itself. Like, for instance, when that block is sliding down the plane, the block actually has force. Well, no, it doesn't. It's just a mass that's moving, and when it interacts with another force, then that interaction is. And that's a hard concept. It's a really hard concept. So we're doing a study this semester in physics at MU. We're trying to get, if you go into science classes here virtually everywhere, what happens is the professor, reads a problem, throws up a formula board and shows the students how to solve it. The Sweller and gang call that a worked example. Okay, I'll work an example for you. What happens though when students do that is they try to imitate the process, and so they develop a process schema, but not a conceptual schema for the kind of problem it is. And so we're trying to get them to stop and say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so one of the methods we're trying out is with a thing that Dieter Gittner at Northwestern developed called analogical encoding. Comparing cases. And in the analogical encoding, what you do is give students a pair of problems. And you say, okay, how are these alike and how are they different? And so you think, well, that's not too difficult a thing to do, but it really is, because we tried to do that on a grand scale with a whole class full of students in an online environment, and what we learned, of course, was that you just can't change students' study scripts in a week. They've been doing this for a long time, and suddenly you're asking them to think about this in a different way, and kaboom. So that's when the old 2x4 hits you across the head and you say, well, we got to try something different here, folks. And so we're working with smaller groups of students at MU and in Kansas State with the analogical encoding and different mapping strategies and so on. As a transfer task, we're using problem posing. So you say, okay, if you're working, say, in a work energy problem, all right, here you compare these two problems, and we're using a thing called TAPS, T-A-P-P-S, think aloud, paired problem solving. One student solves the problem verbally, thinks aloud while they solve the problem, the other person questions them all the time. And they go back and forth. The kids actually like that. And so rather than having them solve another problem, we say, okay, can you pose another problem? Because when students compare problems, in terms of similarity, almost invariably they compare based on surface level characteristics.
That's what you're talking fast, and I'm thinking.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I'm wondering if you could go over something again, because that's what I'm saying. If you're going to use analogical reasoning, is the problem going to be that they don't understand the deep structure of the problem?
That's
so
right.
They can't transfer.
I'm sorry. That's yes. Thank you very much. No, you're thinking real quick. Yes, exactly. The problems we have them compare are structurally similar. We're
and
trying.
they can perceive that. You know, they can perceive
Well,
that.
that's what we're trying to. That's what we're trying to get them to think in terms of similarities and differences. Okay, because we know there are a number of assessment techniques that if you give students a pair of problems, you say compare these or classify them or how similar are they, they'll almost invariably do it based upon surface level characteristics. I do that in my seminar. I teach a class called Design Problem-Based Learning Environments. And the first thing we do in the class, I like to start classes with Q sorts, question sorts, or card sorts. So we generate a whole list of problems, okay? And then I have the students sort them into groups. And graduate students, PhD students, sort them into groups based around surface level characteristics. It's a winter problem. It's not in terms of the kind of problem it is or how structurally how the problems compare. It's a pandemic problem. It's everywhere. So yeah, and we're also then seeing whether or not over a period of 10 weeks we can actually change some of their ontological commitments from a material or substance-based ontology up to a more what Nikki G calls an emergent ontology. I love that stuff. If you haven't read her work,
no,
Nikki G is brilliant stuff. Jen Slata. We actually use some of their problems in our initial interviews, okay? And had students explain. Classic one is you got a switch and a series of light bulbs. So you throw the switch and do the light bulbs come on in a sequence? Do they come on at the same time, or it doesn't matter? A lot of them said, well, they actually come on at the same time. Not because they actually believed they came on at the same time, but because they believed that they knew that electricity traveled so fast that human perception was unable to perceive the sequence of lighting. So the effect came, but in reality they came on in a series. Okay. We've met the enemy, he is us. What's the most common analogy for electricity?
Water.
Water pipe. Right? Which actually causes misconceptions. Okay. That's really one of the problems. You got to be real careful with analogies. Analogies are powerful, but if you take cognitive psychology and you keep boiling it down, you'll come up with an analogy. But they can also be dangerous if you don't use them the right way. So we'll see how that works out. But it's hard. It's hard, because the students see this procedure, this process as being let's get the right answer. Troubleshooting problems, I've been looking around for money to do this. I've got I think it's an exceptionally interesting model, three-part model with a case library. That's analogical reasoning, but it's based around Shank's notion of case-based reasoning. Whenever you have a problem, the first thing you do is try to remember a similar problem you've had. Failing that, you walk next door or call your cell phone and say, hey, I got this problem, what do you think? And you tell us, that reminds you of a story. And engineers are great at that. If you ever want to see case-based reasoning in action, go to a teacher's lounge at lunch. And it's one story after another. Oh yeah, well, that's nothing. This kid did it. Oh yeah, it's one story after another, and they're indexed based upon, in one case, the nature of the infraction or how outrageous it was or whatever else. But it's a very powerful form of human reasoning. But unfortunately, in the academy, it's anecdotal. And anecdotal doesn't have the importance of quantitative stuff, I guess. But the reality is, humans have a natural capacity for stories. And so anecdotal evidence is far better than the empirical evidence you can provide in many cases. But the academy doesn't see it that way. So I've got a simulator, and a model, a systems model, multi-layered model, and basically students go back and forth. Learning curve is going to be huge. It's going to be steep, and it's going to shallow off as students get used to doing that. But I'm certain that we can learn it. So, for instance, if if you're learning how to troubleshoot a car or something, okay, well, what are you going to do? What's the action? What's the first thing you do? I can test the battery, I can check the battery cable, I can test, I don't know. So if I click here, I'm not sure, test starter input. So I get my meter out, I test the starter input. I got to come over here and do a similar thing, pull down, what's my hypothesis? And then if the hypothesis and the action don't match up, then you get an error message, simple enough. And you might want to say, what's the probability of that? Here's the result. Well, it's 13.6 volts, which it ought to be. So my interpretation is battery's fine. It's getting, battery's sending lots of juice to the starter. Policy analysis problems. These are really multi-perspectival kinds of approaches. There's an environment I can show you that we did years ago. It's, you basically, in most policy analysis or systems analysis problems, it's a matter of trying to understand what the different views, perspectives on that problem are, and then argue and justifying that. I'm just now getting around to look at design. I'm also working now on trying to figure out a model for decision making, although that's really scary because there's just a humongous literature on decision making. Decision analysis, it's just, but here's my theory. Also, I'm working on a paper right now which I'm going to EdTech sometime soon called It's Just a Theory, where I'm trying to get students to be a little more critical about their theories. Because most students, if it's in a textbook and it's called a theory, then it must be true. And that's not true. So anyhow, design is such a complex thing, but I think in most design situations, instructional design, engineering design, whatever, you start out with this initial constraints. In instructional design, we may or may not do needs assessment. I know it's in all the textbooks, but you'd be amazed how rarely we actually do a needs assessment. Task analysis if you want, but basically, I'm arguing that design is an iterative, cyclical process of decision making. And at each point, at each cycle, you get new constraints. You identify constraints, but in most design processes, those constraints are emergent. As you come along, you find out more and more constraints, and you got to deal with those and make more decisions. But eventually, over time, as the constraints go away, you get down to you hone in on a design process, design model, if you will, that satisfies us. Okay? A lot of people in design literature talk about optimization. Optimization rarely ever happens. Simon came up with the Nobel laureate economist, came up with the notion of satisficing that in the late 50s. It's a powerful concept. So it's an iterative process. And in the paper, we actually talked about a big project we've had. We're about 70% of the way through a $2.5 million Department of Labor grant to train, develop a curriculum for what I call radiation protection technicians. These are essentially radiation cops who work in power plants, hospitals, production facilities, food and radiation facilities, and they run around making sure that people don't get exposed, or they don't get too much exposure. Okay. When you go in for radiation imaging in a hospital or radiopharmaceutical treatments, okay, you get dosed, okay, and they gotta hide you. You can't leave until they get the Geiger counter out and say, well, okay, your dosage level is down. And it's not a matter of eliminating dosage because you can. Okay. I think you all have a coal plant here that runs the university. So do we. There's a lot more radiation coming out of that coal plant than ever comes out of a nuclear power plant. Their isotopes are pouring off that coal all the time. Way more than you'll ever get out of a power plant. So.
That's comforting.
Well, it's still not bad. The dose is acceptable. Otherwise, they wouldn't let you do it. But still, it's yeah. Well, that's a big issue, because we're obviously going to have to go more nobly over the intermediate term future and see what the solution to our energy problems. Hopefully, for the long-term future, we'll find something better. So I'm arguing, and particularly in design, each decision is based around some constraints that keep emerging. Well, with this process, with this So every time we start doing something, we hit new constraints. We have constraints that the teachers are ex-Navy nuke guys that may have worked for power plants, and they're coming in without teaching experience. We've got NRC regulation, DOE regulation, INPO, power operators regulations. Try and get into, I mean, one of the biggest constraints we've had was getting into a power plant. They're so afraid of anybody doing, they just cover their backsides the whole time. It's absolutely amazing. Even though we're peace-loving professors, you walk around, those guys all with big frowns on their faces all the time carrying Uzis. You know, that's a constraint. But they won't, you know, they won't let you into any radiation-controlled area. They won't let you take pictures of anything. You know, and we're saying, well, you guys, 5 power plants signed on here. You said you wanted to develop this training, but you won't even let us in the bloody door. What are we going to do? So the design is not a, you know, unlike ADDIE, design is not a linear process. Anybody who's actually ever done design knows that it's not a linear process.
But that's the way we usually teach it.
Yeah, well, there's an irony, isn't it? Yeah. I'm not sure exactly what sense this makes. I think that I'm saying that this is not a design model. This is a process model. Design applications are, every time you make a decision, justified, because so often those decisions are based around beliefs and not any kind of empirical data. We just had an oral comprehensive for recently last week, and this lady came up with this unbelievable design. Could not justify anything she did. You know, it looks neat. Well, okay, but not going to cut it. So those beliefs are, there's epistemological assumptions, ontological assumptions, lots of personal theories, your own personal theory about how the world works, and your chosen theory. Games this year, I mean, our field, of course, has been dominated by the technology and not by the learning. That's my major frustration. That's why I'm half-time over at Psych now, because I can't stand my colleagues because they don't give a damn about learning. Learning is irrelevant to the technology. You know, let's get out and play with the toys. So anyhow, so at least get them to identify those constraints, make those design decisions, and justify them. And I think if we go that, if we get students to do that, I think we can improve the quality of thinking a whole lot. But I'm still working on that. That's not. But alas, my work with analogical encoding, and we've done a lot of work in causal reasoning. We got a piece coming out next issue of ETRD 2 years later on causal reasoning, a big paper on causal reasoning. I'm actually, you know, I'm changing my tune and saying, well, these problems aren't all independent. There's some similarity among them. And there is somewhat taxonomic. More complex problems are based around decision making. And so you got to make decisions that are virtually all more common. In design problems, in planning problems, in diagnosis solution problems, you know, what do I think this person has? What kind of treatment am I going to give them? And so on. Those are decisions. And so decisions really pervade virtually all more complex and ill-structured kinds of problems. So it's forcing me into really looking at decision making from a psychological perspective. One of my favorite theories so far is actually the betting theory. Essentially, just anytime you make a decision, you're placing a bet, and you think that it's you know, whichever's the better bet, you're gonna, I don't know, we'll see. But I'm also arguing then that virtually all kinds of problems, I don't want to say all kinds of problems, but I say most kinds of problems, rely on 2 important kinds of reasoning: analogical reasoning and causal reasoning. Those are the 2 most basic cognitive skills that pervade problem solving and perhaps all other kinds of reasoning. I won't really go that far. And of course, those are based on concepts or schemas. Schemas are glued together to make propositions or predicates. And depending on the, and so what we're trying to do with this analogical encoding is to get them to look at the underlying propositions in a problem. Okay, this is a work energy problem, so these things have an effect on these things. And so let's look at 2 problems, and are those propositions structurally similar? Are they structurally aligned? I'm happy to give this. Causal reasoning is really, so I've done some papers on that. We're going to do more. Jalou and I have this big piece coming out on causal reasoning, which is already obsolete because it's 2 years old. I've gone, a couple of quarters and I need to get beyond that, but what are you going to do? So essentially, concepts go together to make these propositions. So we compare problems, or we can compare propositions, or we can compare problems. But essentially, you're comparing the problems for the structural similarity among the propositions within those problems. Causal reasoning, on the other hand, is required for making predictions, making inferences. What happened? Why did this happen? Or what do you think will happen if I do this? Or drawing implications. That's a real interesting area. Nobody in the psychological literature has looked at that. I think I'm going to have to move over to business and the contingency management issues and maybe strategic plan and stuff to find it. And they won't call them implications. The implication is really kind of a proportional, probabilistic kind of causal. Something that may happen but may not. And that's a tough nut to crack. And then justifications. Argumentation really is a form of causal reasoning. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, called causality the cement of the universe. And basically, that's what holds everything together. Things have effects on each other. And we've worked in some business classes, business strategy classes, trying to teach students to be more causal, and I'll show you some other work we're doing as well. So I told you about the analogical problem solving. What we're trying to do is to get them to look at the cause-effect relationships. That's the structural alignment. If two problems have the same cause-effect relationships, then they're structurally aligned. And they can reason conceptually about the problem. And we'll find out if they actually pose a problem that's similar. That's really where we're going with that. Yes, please.
When they do that, are they understanding at a structural level or a mechanistic level? So when they see that deeper structure, are they understanding some kind of a mechanism that facilitates?
Okay, and I'm happy. I've got another 2-hour presentation on causality as well. Okay. No, that's fine. I'm not dismissing that. What I'm saying is you addressed a level of complexity that I hadn't planned to go to. But if you look at theories of causality, and there are many of them from philosophy of science and psychology and whatever else, they talk about fundamentally two different ways of reasoning about causal relationships. One is what's called covariation or quantitative. What's the probability of this affecting that? How strong is the relationship between A and B? Is there any delay in that relationship, and so on and so forth? And basically, that's how we get students to find. I mean, if you look at any equation, any science textbook, that's a statement of causal reasoning. It shows the mathematical relationship between a cause and effect relationship. F equals ma. Okay, Newton's second law. Okay, you multiply mass times acceleration, and you get the force. Okay? That's a statement of the relationship between mass and acceleration. Now, that's a very simple one. There are far more complex ones. Now, but so basically what we do is focus students' attention on just that covariation and quantity. What they miss is the qualitative, the conceptual, or as you refer to, the mechanism. Okay. We published a study in International Journal of Science a couple of years ago with students on where we actually, in some rotational dynamics problems in physics, we had students do a simulation where they could look at the covariation between two variables and see what happened in the simulation. And then we had an influence diagram, which is kind of a concept map, a causal map showing those relationships. And there was no difference in the ability of students to solve the problems quantitatively, but when we asked conceptual questions, the influence, the kids did much better. Again, not surprising, because we're at least focusing their attention on the concepts that are underlying those. And that's a tough one. Jalou, my remaining student's actually doing some really basic research for his dissertation on causality and how causality emerges as a concept. So that's going to be pretty interesting stuff. There's really a few ways of getting at causal reasoning. We can instruct students, like an influence diagram. We can elicit that through questions. We can explore causal relationships, or we can model it. And I'll just A simulation, basically, if you adjust this, you can look at the output, see what the result is. Okay, so that addresses the covariational aspect. Whether the slope goes up, or what the direction of the slope is, whether it's linear, curve linear, or whatever. This was the influence diagram. Yeah, I can show you, this is in Flash, I can show you that if you want. Basically, we did a project for an economics professor a few years ago, and said, when I consult with faculty, a lot of times I'll say, what's the hardest thing you have to teach? And for him, this was an intro micro econ class for non-majors, so they weren't no calc, they weren't going to do numbers. And he said the idea of shifts in supply and demand curve as a function of external forces or perturbations or whatever. So we built a flash demonstration where we walked students through, and the supply lines and the demand lines curves change as each individual thing comes together. And so we're showing them, we're illustrating, demonstrating for them how those apply. Unfortunately, he left the university before we were able to do any research. So, and that was this was a study I alluded to earlier. This was the rotational dynamics problem, and this was a causal map of rotational problems. In fact, we're actually doing rotation this week in our physics class back at MU. They should be ready to go right about now. Doing the analogical encoding on some rotational problems. And that's one of the tougher concepts in Newtonian physics. We can also elicit those with questions. So basically, these are a series of questions that get students to, to basically walk them through. So, think about this. What's going on now? How is that changing? And what, and so on. Again, we haven't done research on that. So, we're doing another study over in ag school in a beef production class. There's a business and ecology to producing cows for beef. It's in terms of when you breed them, where you breed them, how you breed them. Actually, Missouri is the second largest beef producing state in the country, surprisingly enough. They produce them there and they ship them out west to fatten them up. They don't stay in Missouri. They just, don't ask me why. Maybe we have prolific cows, I don't know. So there are a huge number of decisions that have to be made about, nutrition, about what you feed them, how long you feed them, when you feed them, lineage, when you send them out, get them out. There's a huge number of decisions, and what we are doing, and we've done this before, is this is actually one from meteorology, but we actually have students build an expert system to represent those decision-making processes. So the student plays the expert. There's 100 dissertations, 1,000 dissertations. The tool I use is a simple little Windows-based expert system editor that takes about somewhere between 5 and 6 minutes to run. It's just that easy. And so we can actually get students. So we're going to, some of the class is actually going to be developing expert systems. Some of them aren't. One study we published a few years ago showed very clearly that the students who develop the expert systems have a much deeper level of understanding, because they're actually having to wrestle with the ideas on a deeper level. It's just a very, if you want, you get the biggest bang for the buck out of this tool, any technology tool you'll ever use. This is actually a study we did back at Penn State in meteorology. So we had students build a forecaster model. Please.
What's the software called?
Well, this is actually an old Mac. No, this is an old Mac Windows crossover pattern or a thing. We have one called we use one called Win Expert. If you go out and buy a little book, it's an early '90s book from McGraw-Hill called, I believe it's called How to Solve It. There's a subtitle which I forget, and this author's name is Anthony Starfield. He's an ecological engineer from the University of Minnesota, who started this stuff a long time ago. He built a tool. I think the file's huge. It's about 75K. It's just a small Pascal program, but it comes with that book. He actually was called on by the South African government to advise on when they and where they are burned. And he said, well, I'll do you one better. I'll teach you to be fishers of men. And so I'll teach you how to actually, I articulate the decisions that you need to make because you know the area. And it's just a question of how you structure that thinking. It's going to help you do it. And so that's where we ended up. This was one actually trying to predict weather in State College, which is really an adventure. Mike knows this. Which of several different forms of precipitation are you likely to get? Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them, and it depends on what level it's at, and so on and so forth. If you're flown into State College, a lot of times flights get canceled because on the ground it's raining, but 500 feet in the air it's icy, which really isn't good for flight. Okay, it increases drag and weight and load to a point where the lift isn't just enough to keep it going. So. Marcia Lynn developed a little causal modeling tool. This was actually an ecological one where you show the effects of algae on bacteria, pesticides, and water quality. It's a neat little tool. We actually have a proposal into Institute of Educational Science, student cognition, student learning, to actually build a more sophisticated causal model that'll get at those mechanistic as well as the covariational aspects. Have your back terms and still crossing over limbs. And then systems modeling tools. A lot of my classes, I actually do a lot of work with Stella. So I have the kids steep learning curve, have kids build Stella models. This is a model on pollution, what are the sources of pollution. The nice thing about this, it actually has a concept mapping interface which shows the cause-effect relationship. When you click on any of these, there's an underlying formula. You click on that, there's a formula there. Simple pre-algebraic formula or differential equations or whatever you want. Actually, first order differential equations are built into the tool, so it's automatically there are changes over time. It's even simple. This is the most compelling thing you'll ever do with students. You will, actually Barry Richmond, who's a developer of this, a fellow about my age who died of a heart attack about 2 months after he came out and did a workshop. It was scary, a little scary. Came out and did a 3-day workshop for us in Missouri. It's just unbelievable. I think I had 2 functional neurons at the end of the 3 days. The rest of them just all burnt out. They were completely fried. I actually do this in a lot of my psychology classes too, where I have students build models like this of different thinking processes. The underlying notion is if you can't model it, you don't know it. That's the premise of the 3rd edition of the Mind Tools book. So I'm looking now at looking at different problems and looking at how causal and analogical reasoning are related to that and argumentation. In most ill-structured problems, you can't get a solution. You never know what the right solution is. I'm sure the civil engineering professors across the way would love to have their students be able to design a bridge, but if you follow the traditional notion of problem solving, of framing the problem, creating alternative solutions, evaluating those solutions, implementing and evaluating, you realize that actually building a bridge is a long-term and expensive process. So with most ill-structured problems, I'm firmly convinced that argumentation is the way to go. Getting students to argue for or justify their decisions is really as good evidence as you're going to get. And to that end, we've got a couple of different treatments. When I looked into the argumentation literature, a lot of the UNLV people are doing a lot of work on that. The Ed Psych folks out there, it's Gail Sinatra's group. It really comes down to a couple of different approaches. One is a constructive approach, construction. I construct an argument, or another one is an evaluative, evaluate arguments. The evaluation thing is more dialectic. Construction is more constructive. So we're giving students some ethics cases and 2 different tasks. One, in this task, you got 2 solutions. And we have different perspectives, so This started out as a flexibility hypertext. We did one study last spring. That was the spring, must have been fall. We did one study on a flexibility more of a flexibility hypertext study last fall. Said that, you know, the nature of the outcome was not strong enough. Really what you got to get students to do is to argue for the solution. So these are everyday kinds of ethical issues. This is an engineer who's a purchasing officer for a company and accepting gifts from a vendor. And how far do you go there before you draw a line? We have them look at utilitarian. There are some theories that pervade engineering design, ethics, engineering issues. A utilitarian approach, a rights and duty approach, and a virtue approach. And those often conflict. Right? So in one treatment we're having, here's solution 1, here's solution 2, and then we want you to go down. And, okay, which ethical codes support that, which theoretical approaches support that. So basically getting them to learn how to argue by evaluating 2 different arguments. The other treatment is, we scaffolded their construction of an argument. Okay, what should you do? What perspective support that? And then the transfer case 2, that goes away. Write the best case you can. Okay. And so in the control group, basically, we're saying summarize the case. So whether or not the evaluation or the construction will produce a better argument, I'm actually betting on the evaluation approach right now, but I don't know. We'll see.
And how do you end up coding these?
We'll use an argument coding scheme.
Anyone in particular?
Probably generate our own. Yeah. Toolman's way too complex. We've used Steve Toolman's model in a couple of studies, but the notion of warrants and backing is real. That's a conflation really, and so that's real complicated. So we'll generate our own. We'll have to adapt it to the materials we have here, the theoretical approaches and so. A guy named Gary Nussbaum has been doing a lot of this work at University of Las Vegas. They've got a really powerhouse at site for military. In fact, somebody told me when you go out to interview, the basic interview question is, do you want to be a superstar? And if you say no, we'll see you. So, there's a criterion for you. So we'll see. Still, we know the students don't know how to argue. Okay, so how long does it take them to prepare them to train them to argue in some kind of coherent way and give them some reason to argue for? Argumentation, I think we can transfer across domains. We'll be presenting last semester's study at ASEE, American Society for Engineering Ed, and we'll present this next year there. They've got an engineering ethics division, and the papers are just bloody awful. There's no empirical research. Some old guy gets up and talks about how they lecture about ethics. So we have to get smarter about what we do. Those are some things we've done. That's kind of an overview, a 10,000-meter view of what I've been up to. But if anything piques your interest, I'm happy to show you models or examples or whatever, or have a discussion or an argument or whatever. I always like people to argue because they know they're awake. That's always a good sign.
From the standpoint of design, is there an advantage to starting students off, and you have problems that you can put on your typology of here without algorithmic problems, down here with level problems.
Yeah.
Is there an advantage in design to giving the same features of a problem and give it those different faces to a student? So they'll see an algorithmic problem, but the same components of that are going to be in one that's further down the line, it's less well-structured, more ill-structured.
They actually
seeing the differences in those.
I don't think there's that kind of transfer. There might be. There's an algorithm underlying those story problems. Okay. And in fact, on one of the interviews we did with students, I said, well, I prompted him a little bit. He said, how do you solve problems? Well, we look at the number of variables. We find the equation. Well, what if you don't have an equation with those number of variables? Because one of the methods of assessing schema quality that's most popular is a thing called text editing, where you give students the same problem, but you don't say solve it. You say, You may add a piece of information to the problem or remove a piece of information. And you say, is there enough information in this problem to solve it? Is there too much information? Is there not enough information? Sounds simple, but you want to wrench some heads around. Actually, my colleague in Missouri said, hey, he couldn't do that because if he did, the students would all run the dean's office. He was abusing them mightily. So that's that and classifying problems, types of problems. Those are, and that's not easy. I mean, you give students for a final exam, basically, give students all the problems they'd solved in the previous exams, and go back and just say, what kind of problems? Is this a kinematics problem? Is it a work energy problem? Is it a Newton's first law problem? A second law problem? I think that would just really drive them nuts. But if they can't do that, they don't know the physics. They miss the physics. So in terms of actually vertical transfer, I don't think it works. I mean, there might, there's decision making that supports a lot of other things, but I'm, the analogical encoding stuff I find very interesting. But if we actually get effects this semester, we'll be the first. Dieter Gentner did all of her research almost all of her research with Dunker's X-ray problem. It's a classic 1932 problem. You've seen it. The army is marching on a fort or castle, and the analogous problem is you've got a tumor. You want to eliminate the tumor with X radiation, but if you aim all the power, enough power to kill the tumor, you're also going to kill the. So the idea is that you shoot the X-rays from different. So that's a domain neutral problem, and it's a simple problem. There's only one analogy, one concept. She did a little bit of research with some business folks on negotiation strategies, where it's a single concept negotiation strategies, but no one has ever tried to apply it to actual educational problems. And unfortunately, these are well-structured problems that I don't necessarily support, but by God, they're still the coin of the realm. I mean, if you go into every science class, every freshman, sophomore class at this or any other university, that's what they're going to be doing. They're going to be solving equations.
So I was going to ask you, what kind of, just from an anecdotal standpoint, and working with professors in engineering and physics or chemistry, whatever, what kind of feedback, resistance, acceptance are you getting from them when you introduce these pedagogies? Yeah,
that's an interesting question. Of course, we only work with people who are interested, so we work with the early adopters. Right. There are real systemic problems to innovation, particularly in engineering sciences. And they are systemic. Okay? One of the guys, we're actually doing another CCLI proposal due May, I guess, to develop a PBL, problem-based learning course in material science. And we'll compare it with the integration course. That's going to be kind of interesting. But one of the guys actually admitted it in a discussion we had last week. The estimates are, we don't have a clear idea, but the estimates are somewhere between 15 and 20% of all engineering faculty in universities throughout the U.S. have ever been in engineering. So they don't know how to solve engineering problems. They know how to design experiments real well. And those are problems. I mean, I'm not denigrating these people. Many of them are way smarter than I'll ever be. They're brilliant people, but they just don't know how to solve everyday engineering problems. They don't know what to do. Okay. They're designing experiments, they get money from NSF, so on and so forth. They're very successful. But if you actually try to get them to teach engineering problem solving, they're lost. They know how to do it. And that's kind of the nature of faculty all over. In the course I teach on designing problem-based learning environments, I regularly have groups of students. What I do is actually indenture them to professors around the university who want to try to build an environment. And we work through various theories and models and so on and see if it applies to their particular one. And regularly they'll come back and say, boy, we asked Professor so-and-so a question and he didn't really answer. Professors, if you look at it, for the most part, study about, and so they learn about a field. But so many of the professors in so many domains don't know how. They've never learned how to be in it. I mean, this is a problem that's pandemic in colleges of education as well. Some colleges of education actually require faculty to go back into the classroom for, K-12 organizations, to go back into the classroom for some, annual refresher or whatever. So, it's not, and you get into certain fields, like sociology, and there really aren't many jobs in sociology. There's social work jobs, but that's a different field. It's a different discipline. I was invited over to do a workshop on some modeling stuff in Indiana State last August. And I had one poor lady from social psych. I was trying to get them to generate some problems to show they could model it and so on. And so I kept trying to get them to think about, well, what kind of problems do social psychologists solve? Or what kinds of problems, what kinds of issues, or what kinds of activities would a social psychologist be able to advise on? If somebody had a problem and wanted to come to a social psychologist for their advice, what might that be? I tried every permutation I could. I was just bending over backwards. Fortunately, the rest of the class realized what was going on. They said, but this lady hadn't a clue how to answer the question. She could refer to the chapter titles in her textbook. And she could say, well, so what do you teach? Well, we teach this theory and that theory and that theory. Well, but what good are they? Howard Gardner says the theory has no meaning unless you can apply it. And that's absolutely, I believe that's about as close to the truth as we can get.
The board behind you there.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's right. Yeah, very similar. So, that's a pandemic problem. In universities. And that's systemic. We reward people for all the wrong reasons. When I'm working in Singapore, it's really kind of interesting, particularly the business faculty actually reward people for upper level business experience. So they'll actually give people promotions based upon how good a business person is, because they realize that that's a value. In most cases. One of University of Missouri's more illustrious alums is none other than Ken Lay.
He did take a business ethics class, I guess.
No, actually, exactly. He did his bachelor's and master's there, and ironically enough, it was a couple of years ago, I guess, when he was just becoming embroiled in the lawsuits. He'd actually endowed the university to the tune of $1.3 million, I guess, for an endowed chair. And in the middle of his mess, I guess, he came to the university and asked for his money back.
I need my legal fees.
Exactly, to pay his legal fees. And the university said, I'm not sure what they're going to do with the money. I hope they give it to charity, because who the hell are you going to get to take the Ken Lay chair?
We call it the KL chair.
Yeah, exactly. Unless it's the Ken Lay chair of business ethics or something. Yeah. Fortunately, some of our more illustrious alums are better known as Brad Pitt and Sheryl Crow. A little more illustrious and a little less dubious, I think. Mort Walker, who did Rita Bailey. So STEM problem solving, it's, I guess to summarize, it's really, it's all over the place. It's remarkable how little attention, though, that they give to problem solving. In most engineering programs, in your senior year, you get a capstone course. They actually give you an everyday, real-world kind of problem. And my argument is, why should you have to wait until your fourth year to figure out what you're supposed to learn in the first place?
Well, I've got an engineering professor, and actually the online course that I'm teaching this semester, and he's in an engineering school, and he's talking about this capstone courses. And one of the things that he's got the funniest way of looking at these different multimedia theories, and he's constantly criticizing them. Anyway, one of the things.
Which theories?
Starting from action theory, and just different taxonomies of theories that are laid out, and he always is comparing that to his own experience. And,
sure.
And
we all build personal theories.
It's a fair way to do it, but he he's talking about the fact that, you know, the students getting this capstone course is they really can't, his idea is that you can't give us a freshman an ill-structured problem. They have to be lectured to, because they don't have enough knowledge to solve the problem.
I call it the silo theory.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's what he's always talking about this, and trying to challenge him a little bit, say, okay.
Well, there actually is some very interesting, I mean, if you look in the literature, it's not a huge literature on problem-based learning in engineering ed. There are a few programs around the world that are all problem-based, none of which are in the U.S. Interestingly enough. Aarhus in Denmark, and Macquarie in Australia, and there's one in England and Canada and so on. But the most success has come from engineering design courses, which tend to be freshman courses. They've had phenomenal success with that. My wife was director of engineering education at Penn State when she was there, and they did an interesting study with a freshman design course. They gave them a fairly simple mechanical problem, developing a can crusher or something like that. And then the students had to come up with a design. And they had to justify it, develop a presentation and justify it, and so on and so forth. And they did pre-post analysis with Perry's scale or scheme of epistemological development, and found that those kids in one semester jumped about 2.5 points, which is the equivalent of what most kids do in 4 years of college. I mean, because they lived ambiguity. I mean, you know, not everybody came with the same design. In fact, they all came with a different design. And they all had a different argument for justifying. That's what it means to be an engineer. And the sooner these kids find that out. Because when you know, I mean, first of all, if you drill those ideas into them, the forgetting curve is inviolable. We know that they'll forget it. Most of them, if they use brute force memorization, they'll forget 80% in 24 hours and about 98% by the end of the week. And so how can we learn anyhow? And second, by the time they actually get around to using the knowledge, it'll probably be obsolete. By the time they actually graduate and get out in the world and actually use what they've learned. So, you know, but it's a weakness that we all have, myself included, because we've all spent 20 or 30 years, or however many, for me it's 30 years, professing, learning, studying about our field. So, we intuitively or tacitly believe that whatever we're studying is the most interesting thing on earth. And why everybody doesn't recognize that is impossible to understand. But there is a tendency to want us to try to teach students everything we've learned in 30 years in 15 weeks. And you can't do it. You can't do it.
You know, you talk about the capstone and where you had a kind of the final problem to deal with.
Yeah.
Has there anybody ever tried the reverse of that? On the first day, the first freshman walk in, they get this problem?
Yeah, no, that's what the engineering design, at Penn State, they had a very successful freshman design course. What happens, and that's where it happens. That's where you need, if you're going to implement change or innovation, it's got to happen at the beginning. Because these kids come in from the farm and wherever else, okay? And they come into college, and because they said you got to go to college, so they have a vague notion of what they may want to do, and so for the first 2 years they sit in huge lecture halls full of other kids being lectured at by professors or graduate students or whatever else, and so they develop a script. This is college. This is what we do, okay? But so you know, then if you try to get them involved in more problem-based learning stuff, they're more resistant, because they've developed these well-rehearsed scripts for actually doing this college, and so by golly, you know, now you're asking me, you're changing the rules on me, and that's not fair. So if you want to innovate, do it in freshman year. I mean, it's going to be way more successful than it would.
Where's that study published? Where is that?
In Journal of Engineering Ed. It's Mara, Litzinger, and Palmer, I think it was 99 or something.
99-ish?
Yeah, they're about, I think it's Mara Litzinger, Tom Litzinger, who actually was head of one of their innovation centers. A brilliant guy, mechanical engineer from Princeton, but really smart. And Betsy Cole. Yeah, not yet, just
That was part of my question was doing the freshman course on design courses is a real fascination, obsession of mine, and so I was going to curious about finding out more information about that.
There are a number of studies. I mean, if you look at the PBL literature in engineering, a good bit of it goes into the most successful examples. I mean, if you look at PBL, there's sort of a continuum from, I suppose that one way extreme of the continuum is your basic physics course, freshman physics course. There are problems, and we're solving problems all the time. Okay, all the way up to the medical school model, the Barrows model, where the students come in day one, they get, here's the patient, they're presenting, you know, they're actually using more video now, here's the patient presenting, here's the history, here's the physical exam data, because you wouldn't do anything until you got that. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And nobody, you know, so they work in teams of, I think, 7 or 8 there. They all have a specific role, they rotate those roles week by week, and they make hypotheses about what it might be, they figure out what it is they don't know, they figure out a strategy for what they need to know. On Monday they go out, they get back together on Wednesday, and they teach each other the underlying physiology and anatomy and whatever else they need to do. So that's on that extreme. The entire curriculum is problem-based. Okay? And that's a mind blow. Yeah. We were actually doing a presentation over there for some engineering faculty, and we showed them the curriculum, what they do. And every day they go through, I mean, every week they go through a series of problems. And there's some content orientation there. You can't do a 2-year medical program and leave out the respiratory system. Whoops, well, we just didn't get a problem now. But we started talking with these engineering faculty, and I said, well, you know, one of the implications here is that all your courses go away. You know, that drew a stunned silence. Huh? Your courses, you know, you teach courses. Yeah, that's what we do, yeah, right. Well, they go away. You don't teach courses anymore. Huh? It was just like, they just couldn't contemplate. Well, what do you, I'm a professor, I teach courses, that's what I do. And so the idea of all those courses going away and you have a series of problem-solving experiences is, you know, so teaching professors how to be good tutors is really one of the major challenges. And actually one of the things that's made our program successful is that we will use graduate students in ed psych sometimes to be tutors, because they're better tutors. Physicians are very busy, they got the clinical practice, they got the research practice, and their teaching practice, and so their default is if somebody asks them a question, well, they get an answer. Which seems like a reasonable approach, but what you want to do is to train the students to actually try to figure out how to get the answer themselves. And they cheat. They make, you know, the director of the program, Mike Hasakawa, was telling me a really interesting anecdote or story a couple of years ago where one of the sessions, somebody came in, the patient had presented, I forget what the symptoms were, but she had actually gone online, and online there are some nice expert systems where you can plug in symptoms, the symptomology of the patient, and chomp it through, and it comes back with a diagnosis. So she proudly came back without relating the fact that she used this system, where she came into the class and said, "Yeah, I think it's a large prostate." And the teacher there said, "Well, that's a very interesting hypothesis, given that the patient is a woman." Whoops. Okay, well, so, you know, sometimes if you cheat, you get caught. But I've never witnessed more mature learning in my life with these kids. Now they are, you know, they're graduate students. They're hand selected. I mean, our students were average because we're in Missouri. We ain't Harvard. We ain't Stanford. So we don't get the creme de la creme. Okay. But they're still smart. I mean, you know, and we're fairly selective in terms. And there's, you know, the nice thing about medical programs is we only admit 100 students a year. So we just don't know on a curriculum-wide basis how well that's going to work with undergraduates, whether they're mature enough, whether they're perseverant enough. You know, we don't know. So right now, most of the stuff that's going on, most of the PBL stuff in engineering and law and business are course level innovations or module level innovations.
One thing particularly I'm just finding myself getting very emotional about is whether the students will look at multiple perspectives and multiple potential solutions during design.
Yeah.
And there's lots of different types of research being done and finding out that freshman college students basically just don't do it, and that seniors do it some, and that professors and people out in the field do it more. But I have yet to see an article that says it was the taking of the capstone or the cornerstone course that made them get better. We know that over the 4-year period of college, they went from horrible to
Well, it's normal
so-so.
there's got to be some maturation over 4 years, unless the kids stay completely drunk the whole time.
So that was one.
It's a goal for some of them, I know.
One of the things I'm looking at, I'm looking at the multidisciplinary group and various designers, and one thing that's fascinating me is the different design cultures.
Yes.
Working with architects,
Right.
computer scientists,
Right.
structural designers, and engineers. And
There's also product design people.
What?
Product design people.
The product design people, and
Yeah.
the product designers and the architects
Yeah.
really generating
Yeah.
multiple ideas as part of their design culture.
Interesting, yeah.
Engineers and
Yeah.
computer scientists are funneling in.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that I'm starting to look at. What are the differences in design culture? And how can we learn from various design cultures to enrich our design culture? So it really is very cultural specific, but in product design, for example, the culture is a lot of ideas have to die before you find the right one. So generating multiple ideas is a very, it's an entry-level skill that they learn. And what are the entry-level skills and what are the capstones?
Right.
And when are they introduced across the various design cultures? It's really very fascinating to me because I'm coming from the instructional design,
Right.
the instructional design culture, and so it's really eye-opening.
It is, yeah. And that's why I've always hesitated to even jump into design because it is so discipline specific.
Yes, it is.
And so, I'm virtually convinced that it's impossible to come up with any kind of generic construct about what design really is.
And I'm starting to work with artists, and they have a whole.
Exactly.
That's all different still, because that's very individualistic. There's a lot of holding on to one thing.
And that's where a lot of creativity comes in. People talk about creativity in design. I'm not sure what it is, frankly, but I know that some have it and some don't, and that artists and musicians probably have more of it than other people.
I'm trying to finish nailing down a dissertation topic at
Uh-huh.
this point in my life, and I know I want to do something on design, design learning.
Yeah.
And I've been reading about, well, like I said, the fact that different ways of measuring it, freshmen are bad at the multiple perspectives, and seniors are better.
Well,
The stuff
that's-
I've been
that's
looking
a-
at
that issue
doesn't
is-
show which year they became better. Was it this
Uh,
or this?
It's
or-
probably a linear progression, I think. Although, if you look at the research, there's not a whole lot, but maybe a dozen or so studies on Spiro's notion of cognitive flexibility theory. One of the difficulties is to get students to do the crisscrossing, to look at these cases from multiple thematic perspectives and multiple personal perspectives and so on and so forth. Again, we've met the enemy and he is us. I mean, these kids have been trained to get the right answer. And when you tell them there is no right answer, that makes them real nervous. And the idea of actually trying to find what the right answer is or construct your own right answer is really very difficult. That's why we've taken this, with the ethics thing, we've actually imposed a fairly strict argumentation structure on it.
We have done here that we have a 2-year fully integrated interdisciplinary core curriculum. It's very alternative, and it based on constructivist principles and so forth. And then we did
In which
it's a group of, first we did a group of about 20 students, now we've got a group of about 60 students. It's 2 years, so it takes your whole core, but you stay with a kind of a learning community.
So it's
and
a cohort?
taught by a team. During those 2 years it is.
cool.
And it's the theme is earth sustainability, could be about anything. It's team taught, and anyway, there's a variety of very radical features, but we did an epistemological measure. And actually what we found, which is the multiple perspectives, and we actually got a significant interaction between development and participation in that course.
Oh, yeah.
So that you get some development in the other group, which is, as you were saying, would be sort of a slow linear thing, but then in the other group, you could, in this instructional environment, that is very different than the one we were just discussing, you can actually change by asking students to actually do some of the things we've been talking about here today, the students actually did change in how they approach.
If you give them something that actually requires them to do that, where, you know, if they realize in their own life that there aren't, you know, single answers. We're actually doing an epistemological survey too. What do you use?
I use the measure of epistemological reflection by maximum goal.
Okay.
And we also just did it coterminously with the Shomer-Akins.
Okay. Yeah, I don't like those framework theories. I really prefer the developmental perspective.
Well, maximum goal has more of the stage theory, and
right.
Shomer-Akins has more of the belief theory. The problem is it takes 200 years to co-roll individuals.
I know.
That's why I asked you what your
Same thing.
about.
We're actually using, we used a version of Shomer's last semester. It wasn't predictive at all. It's just too many factors. Although I've had a lot of students use the EDI, which is a derivation. The UNL big group is a derivation of Shomer's. I'm using Deanna Kuhn's, which is a simple 15-question kind of thing that separates people into absolutists, multiplicists, and evaluatists.
And that was worked okay.
Don't know.
Yeah, because
We'll find out.
What we also found is that the epistemology related to important parts of critical thinking, induction, and meaning making, but didn't relate to grades.
Yeah. No, that's actually true. My wife did a follow-up study to the one at Penn State. It was a small-scale study where they took the kids on, Perry scale is a 9-point scale, although very few people ever get to 7 or beyond. So they, and of all the hundreds of students they interviewed, they found 5 that were level 7 or beyond. So they took they did interviews with those 5 kids, and these were seniors, I think, junior seniors, in terms of what their drivers were and so on. And I'm not sure, it was 3-2 one way or the other, but which it was I forget now. Half of them, virtually half of them, were 3.8 GPA overachievers, and the other half were like my undergraduate program. They were 2.0 people hanging on by their fingernails because they saw, and it actually researching this has actually helped me reflect on my own experiences because I just thought undergraduate school was a joke. I just got so mad at those people where they would never, you're telling me about the world, and you won't even tell me what it is I'm supposed to know, let alone why I'm supposed to know. I'm just supposed to memorize some stuff and hope I can figure out what it is you want to know, or you want me to know. And so, and they were smart kids. They're really smart kids, but they were just completely turned off by the whole mechanistic process of undergraduate education. That's small data, but it's supportive of what we found.
Yeah.
Is it Kuhn instead of Vicky?
Kuhn, Deanna Kuhn.
Oh, C-O-O?
K-U-H-N.
Oh,
One of my Bibles is, she did 91, she published a book called The Skill of Argument. She's a teacher's college, one of my heroes. She's an absolute bully.
I was wondering if you were going to use any of her stuff, or if you had some rubric of hers you could translate directly into yours.
We will, but we'll have to adapt the rubric to the nature of the task, obviously.
Well, I'm interested.
Yeah. So, this area, like virtually every area in our field, is I think is fascinating. I tell my students all the time, there are really a couple of different ways you can go in graduate school. You can go into a discipline where everything is known, but you'll have a devil of a time finding a dissertation topic. Probably the best example is English. Trying to do a dissertation in English, trying to find a topic that hasn't been flogged to death is a real challenge. At the other extreme is a field like ours, where the number of questions increase far more rapidly than the number of answers we've got. So, it's an unlimited potential for doing theory-based kinds of research here, and I find that attractive. Some people don't, but that's fun. Sir?
It was on logical reasoning that we were talking about. If you're teaching physics, for example, you want students to learn from something that they already know in an open hour. For example, you talked about teaching electricity and water, the knowledge of water in a pipe.
Right.
How best would you design such kind of instruction so that they don't really pick up those misconceptions from the...
Well, that's an interesting question, and there are many answers to that question. Probably the best was articulated by Rand Spiro, And that's actually the kind of research that got him into cognitive flexibility theory, if you're familiar with that, was the idea of the danger of over-reliance on a single analogy and the concomitant necessity of using multiple analogies. Okay? You really, I mean, if you want to get students to understand something, you have to use multiple analogies. And you have to make sure that they're that they do that structure mapping, that they're mapping the structural characteristics of the analogy over. What is it about water that helps people understand electricity? Nothing, I think. It's a convenient metaphor, but it causes way more misconceptions than it does in terms of actually how the electrons.
I understand now that they've started using electricity as a model.
Oh, there you go. Well, I think that'll confuse the fluid flow people too. So, now I'm not, fluid dynamics is a very interesting topic. We actually created a really neat little simulator back at Penn State on fluid dynamics. But that's also a tough topic. Okay.
Let's start over.
Yeah. Ooh, let's see. I think it's a great field, and Lord knows, we really, I mean, that's what people get paid to do. Nobody gets paid for writing in blue books. Okay? Nobody gets paid for memorizing stuff. That doesn't mean that I get people all the time saying, well, mean there's no memorization in 10? No, that's there are some aspects. Or they'll come and say, well, what about actors? I said, well, if all of the actors got paid to do is to memorize, they'd probably be lousy actors. But clearly memorization, there are some aspects of memorization to many jobs, but that's not the nature of the job. You memorize stuff.
It kind of brings it, the old problem of efficiency versus the effectiveness in an academic situation. I mean,
It's the industrial model.
you have to figure out what to do,
Right.
whether you have enough time to get the content, or is content really kind of secondary to the process to be more effective, and you do away with less content, and you have to kind of balance that.
That, Mike, is the academic's dilemma. It's a breadth versus depth issue. And most of us err on the side of breadth as opposed to depth.
Especially with accountability too, thinking
I have colleagues all the time who talk about content. I think content's a dirty word. I don't like to talk about content. Well, what's the stuff you teach? Well, I may teach that there are different ideas out there, but if you read a textbook, that's one person's interpretation of how the world works. It's not the truth. It's if you read another textbook, you may get a different interpretation. If you do, that's what professors do. Well, I don't know how often I have conversations with people about my instructional design courses. Well, what textbook do you use? As if that defines what I do in a class, and I hate them all.
So back to your point of frustration with our field and focus on technology. I'll get the question, well, what tools are you teaching?
Right.
And it drives me crazy. It's like, well, I'm not
Right.
putting you on this tools.
Yeah, that's right. It's, my frustration is even our program is called learning technologies, but the learning part just gets ignored.
Lost.
Yeah. And if you see
Are we
stuff.
going to use tools? Absolutely.
Yes, that's right.
But I'm not teaching tools.
Yeah, that's right. That actually reminds me of the worst experience of my entire 30-year teaching career, I think, or actually 40, I'll let you know. If I include my elementary school experience. When I was at Penn State, I taught a mind tools course online, and face-to-face, the only useful thing for a lab is actually to teach a tool if you decide you want to use that tool. It's quick. The to get people up. For instance, the expert system tool. I can, in a lab, I can show people, demonstrate, we can get feedback, boom, 20 minutes and you're gone. You're going. So in the course, basically, I wanted to have students build databases, concept maps, spreadsheets, all that good stuff. So that represented what they were teaching. And so you really have two choices, I think. Well, there's probably lots of choices, but two fundamental choices. You can say, thou shalt use this piece of software on this platform, which of course is silly, because you'll never get everybody. Well, I haven't got a Mac, or I haven't got a PC, or I haven't got that software. I don't know. So okay. Option 2 is, well, you're welcome to use whatever software you want on whatever platform you want. Okay, and it's okay. Well, the students, many of whom were elementary teachers. I mean, it was just there's more whining than I've ever had. They expended all of their energy learning how to use the software, and they completely missed the point of the course. And because when they built these models, these maps, it would be like something that a third grade student would do. I kept saying, well, you're graduate students. I want you to think like graduate students, but it may be that elementary mindset. I don't know. But it was the most abject failure of my entire teaching career. It was an exercise in frustration.
Can I ask a more personal question? I thought I was about the only person with a physics background interested in instructional design.
Yeah.
So I'm curious.
No, I'm not. I actually come to physics late. My last physics course was in high school.
Okay.
Back in the dark age. Although, interestingly enough, we use, I think one of the best innovations, curricular innovations in the entire history of education was PSSE physics, called Physical Science Study Commission, and it was an inquiry-based physics course. It was similar to BSCS biology, if you're old enough to remember that. These were inquiry-based. Yeah.
Wait a minute. Never mind.
No, I heard about it.
You saw that in the history.
Yeah.
I read about the book once, that's right. These were inquiry-based innovations that were really exceptional. Okay. I ended up doing chemistry in college, not physics.
So from the past tense, does that mean those innovations are gone? They don't teach them anymore?
Apparently they are. Can't find a thing about it. Can't find it. That was actually one of the best examples of situated learning, though, because in chapter 2 we had to use trigonometry. And I was a junior in high school. I'd never seen trigonometry before, but in order to solve the problems, I had to make sense out of it, and it made sense. And I took a trigonometry course the next year, and none of it made any sense. They weren't applying it to anything. I claim all the time that one of the worst parts about math courses is they're taught by mathematicians. Not that I have anything against mathematicians, they're brilliant people, and they have a gift for abstract reasoning that I don't have, and that most of us don't have. The problem is, of course, they assume everybody does. They assume that everybody can think mathematically and abstractly, and they can't. So, the best way to teach math is math for dummies, applied math. But they don't see it that way. But it's more problem-based kind of limitations. But I am, because there was a crossroad in my life. I took one road and went one way. If I stayed the other road, I'd gone to Purdue and been a mechanical engineer.